Well, hello everybody. Thank you for coming. This is a talk about London's hidden rivers. So really, how many are there? This becomes almost a pub quiz question. And it depends what you count as rivers. Many of them are more rivulets and streams than they are rivers. But they are, of course, what has made London. Because when you think about it, everybody needs water, and therefore the earliest dwellings were always alongside water. So the villages grew up alongside these usually meandering streams and rivers, which in North London flow downwards towards the Thames. We're not talking about the ones the other side of Highgate Ridge that go down differently. And, we do see them. Even though they're hidden, they bubble up from time to time in people's basements or the odd well or even in drains. And then we're reminded just how important they are. So the first map shows us the best known rivers. The Effra, the Neckinger, Earl's Sluice and Falcon Brook, south of the Thames, and north, Stamford Brook, the Westbourne, Tyburn, Fleet and Walbrook. There are 21 tributaries of the tidal Thames which flow, the tidal Thames within Greater London, and each of them has their own tributaries. London lost most of its rivers, of course, over the last 100 years. As the town developed, they became buried, and some people call them lost rivers, but really they're not, because many of them have developed secondary use as sewers. Now, the streets of ancient London, I've told you that, followed hedgerows, really, and fields had to be watered. The lowlands were very poor areas, always damp because they were very close to the water table, and there were a lot of respiratory illnesses, just as there are today, from living in damp, mosquito-ridden then areas. So the low-lying East London had much higher death rates, always has had, because it was less healthy, and as ever, the richer people chose to live higher up near the starts of the streams and the rivers. So being near a river could kill you, but also water has always had a mystical significance. And the Romans actually floated their gods on the river. So my first river is the Tyburn, and the Anglo-Saxon Ty means boundary stream. The Tyburn flows all the way from Hampstead Hills under Buckingham Palace to the Thames at Pimlico. We're going to follow it a little bit on its way down. It's squeezed, if you can remember from the map, the wide Fleet and the very substantial Westbourne. Again, we'll talk more about that one later. And it seems to be a minor watercourse. More of a stream really, and no use for transporting goods, but it was a boundary and therefore very important in shaping what we know as London today. So it flowed through meadows in Hampstead until the 19th century. We don't quite know because there are no early records at that point, but probably because of water extraction, its route changed. By 1670, it followed its present route, passing through Pimlico, and it was only completely covered only in the 1960s. It's really quite late, isn't it? The house, number 68, on the corner of Fitzjohn's Avenue and Lyndhurst Avenue, is called Shepherd's Well. And there is a niche in the boundary wall which marks the site of the well itself. This was a source of drinking water for the local people, and it is thought that this was pretty much one of the sources of the Tyburn, and the conduit there actually fed the Tyburn itself. There's a plaque which you can see from the slide, and then behind it there's the splendid Gothic conduit house. From there, the river flows down to Swiss Cottage, channeled into a sewer in about 1874, quite late. And that was because very swanky new houses were built in Fitzjohn's Avenue. Down to Swiss Cottage, and under what today we call is the Central School of Speech and Drama. Then from there it goes down through St John's Wood, which was part of the ancient forest of Middlesex. And as I say, I did tell you it was quite swanky, all this, towards Regent's Park. And it enters Regent's Park beyond what is today Avenue Road, so under Avenue Road and across the canal, Charlton Bridge. And that goes into the park, flowing into the boating lake, which was created by the Tyburn being dammed. And in the year 2000, a group called Silent UK walked through what was by then a sewer under the Charlton Bridge, emerging in Regent's Park themselves, and one of them remarked that they were very glad indeed it was only 40 metres. Yes. So Regent's Park, of course, has glorious stuccoed villas. One of them, Winfield House, which actually belonged to it's the official residence, or was then, of the American ambassador, built in 1937 by the Woolworth heiress Barbara Hatton. She had 7 husbands, including Cary Grant, and it is said the Tyburn actually flows underneath her house. From there it goes towards Marylebone, and Marylebone Lane today, if you remember, it's very windy and bendy, and that's because it's following the course of the original Tyburn, which actually has a conduit built in very early in 1272. So the two maps show you Marylebone Lane following the river, and then further over the blocks of houses, which of course are much more regimented and squares because they're not following a river. On then to Marylebone Corner, and from there, if you think about Marble Arch, as it is called today, and an area of Paddington, this was an area called Tyburnia because the Tyburn gallows were at Marble Arch, and the name was so notorious that people really objected, didn't want to live in an area called Tyburnia, and so it was changed to Paddington. And that became Tyburn Lane became Park Lane, and eventually part of Oxford Street. And this is a picture you can see of the wooden gallows from which staggering numbers of people were hung. And just around the corner there's the Tyburn Convent. Here's a picture of it. There are Benedictine nuns who live there, and the only time they ever leave the building is to vote in an election. Okay, we're now crossing Oxford Street, and this is a picture of a building in Mayfair which claims to have this water in Davia Mews. They claim it's the Tyburn, but I think it can't possibly be because the Tyburn is a sewer and it would smell. So I think that is untrue, but a nice story. So then it flows down towards Buckingham Palace through Green Park. And if you can picture Green Park Station today, it stands on what was an enormous swamp. It was the Chelsea Waterworks Company built a large reservoir, and which was fed by the Tyburn, of course. That was filled in and demolished in 1842, but when you walk through Green Park, there is still a broad valley today, which is where the Tyburn was flowing underneath. So it goes down to Buckingham Palace, vanishes under the palace in a sewer, and onto the Thames via the King's Scholars Pond. Now, there was a splendid man called John Hollingshead, who called himself, he was a Victorian urban explorer, and he was a map maker, and he walked the sewer underneath Buckingham Palace, and that was in 1860. And he wrote, "Of course my loyalty was excited, so I took off my fan-tailed cap and led the way with the national anthem, insisting that all my guides did the same." The other person who went onto Buckingham Palace was Eric Newby, the explorer, and he emerged somewhere, I'm not exactly sure where, in 1963, but he came up a manhole and he surprised a girl who was walking her poodle. So it's obviously quite a thing walking the sewers. My next river is the Walbrook, and it's very small. It's been described as the most elusive, mysterious and comprehensively buried of all London's rivers. And the confluence with the Thames was where the Romans chose to build their city, and presumably, as I said at the beginning, throw in their gods. So it had tanneries, potteries, workshops of all kinds, and all kinds of things. Artefacts are still emerging from that period, but it's also the shortest. Very quickly it became choked with rubbish and disappeared really almost as early as the 1st century. But what was important about it was that it divided the city into two hills, with Ludgate to the west and Cornhill to the east. And it has been suggested that the name Walbrook derives from foreigners, which means native Britons, because there were a lot of native Britons, the Welsh, who settled there. The Saxons built on the higher status, Ludgate Hill, of course. The ancient Britons had the less healthy. But the excavations continue today. We're still discovering a huge amount, really, about the Walbrook. And the next photo, the Walbrook Mythanium, built about AD 240. This is a reconstruction, this slide. And it's covering a whole new history of the city, what was dumped in its waters. And the Temple of Mithras was one of them. We know it was built on the banks of the Walbrook. So what is its source? Well, really, we don't know. Nobody does. It's very complicated because so many people make claims to it. It has so many tributaries, and that's probably the reason. And this next slide is an artist's interpretation called Forgotten Streams. Then there's another version. Now this chap, Alan Dent, standing on what he says is the source of the Walbrook in Spitalfields. Here he is, and his map of the Walbrook, which he calls an anecdotal map, that he did in 2013. But those wiser than me think that actually the most likely source for it is the lost Holy Well, a sacred spring with the priory of St John the Baptist, Holy Well. And there is still, nothing really remains, but there is a dank drain in Curtain Row which runs parallel with the run of the river. And that, of course, was William Shakespeare's original land, and in 1570s home to Shakespeare's company, the Chamberlain's Men, which was built in the ruins of St John's Priory. And here's a picture of a plaque to the Curtain Theatre. So then the main branch of the river goes alongside Blomfield Street, which was then known as Deep Ditch in its early days, runs down what, as I say, today's Blomfield Street to the east of Finsbury Circus, and then under the city wall. And here it is, just west of All Hallows on the Wall. The Walbrook can't be seen today, but it does have a street named after it, and one of the most beautiful of all the city churches. Christopher Wren's St Stephen Walbrook, with the dome by Christopher Wren anyway, and as the slide shows you the interior, the altar is Henry Moore. Now, the London Wall seems to have had an unintended impact on the Walbrook, acting like a dam to impede the flow of water. And this is interesting because it's rather what we're trying to do today, to slow water down. So instead of going in a great rush in a straight line, it characterised the open space at Moorfields, and the Walbrook went underneath, and so it might have flooded, but the wall diverted some of it, which prevented the flooding. Then the river goes under what is today Broadgate Centre, and what used to be Broadgate Station, no longer there, and before that a mass burial ground for plague victims and the Royal Bethlehem Hospital. This next slide is the bronze standing outside Broadgate by Richard Serra, and this is 55 feet or 16.8 metres high, and it's immediately above the Walbrook. And in fact you can occasionally hear it if you listen very carefully. Just behind Liverpool Street is Draper's Hall. There is a garden now with 5 mulberry trees and a fountain to remind us of the Walbrook. Here's a picture of Draper's Hall Garden, which was once the site of Thomas Cromwell's mansion. Under the Bank of England, in the courtyard of the Grocer's Hall, where you put your ear to the manhole and you can still hear it. And of course many trades operated near the river because they needed the water, and this is why you have so many livery companies all along the site of the Walbrook, right going down to the Thames, and the tanners, the cutlers, the dyers, the skinners and more. So the last above ground section of the Walbrook was the Dowgate Inlet, one of 3 main city ports. There was a ferry to cross the Thames and a conduit for channelling the flood waters. Today, Cannon Street Station is on what was probably the governor's mansion, we don't know. Today, there is a pebbly beach with very slimy steps at the end of Curzon Street and Walbrook Wharf, which is now used to load refuse onto barges to the enormous Mucking Marsh landfill at Essex. And I'm now moving on south of the river. The River Peck. I wonder how many of you heard of it. I suspect not that many, because the poor thing really is mainly a sewer today, but the reason is because it rises in the equivalent of the Highgate Heights south of the river, really quite steep hills. This next map shows the Peck joining Earl's Sluice, which is really a built drain, and that's flowing into the Thames at Surrey Dock. But I'm going back to where it rises, and it's fed by 3 springs, the highest one at One Oak Tree. Here's this photo. Nice picture of it. Then it flows down to marshy land in Peckham and Rotherhithe. Honor Oak is a public park, a nature reserve and an SSI, Site of Special Scientific Interest. And it's a remainder of the Great North Wood, which was owned by the abbots of Bermondsey before the Reformation, then the Crown, and it once stretched as far as Croydon. The oak is the 3rd on its site, and this one dates from 1880, after the previous one was struck by lightning. The hill was used as a gun base for shooting down Zeppelins in the First World War, and is a beautiful spot. It's one of London's hidden gems. When the park was enclosed without warning to build a golf course, the locals were so angry that they pulled down the fence, barricaded it, all the while singing Rule Britannia, and saved it as a public park, which it still is today. The modern Southwark Lewisham boundary follows the line of the River Peck all the way to the Thames. Beyond the park there's a huge reservoir which was built in 1909, and Walter de la Mare played on the banks of the reservoir when he was a boy. To Peckham Rye Park, local volunteers who look after the park uncovered the Peck at this point, and here it is flowing relatively clean looking water over gravel in Peckham Park. And here's the English Garden. If you don't know Peckham Park, which is a separate bit of land from Peckham Rye, it's very lovely. I do recommend it. The Japanese garden uses the water of the Peck, but then I'm going to skip over the next bit because then it goes underground, under miles and miles of housing and development following the railways. But there are still some pubs which give you some idea of what it was like, because the cattle dealers of course followed it so that their cattle could have water, and there's still a Kentish Drovers pub right in the town centre. So the Victorian settlements, Millwall Football Club, Rotherhithe we get to, and eventually the Peck comes into the Thames here, this next slide, which is called Earl's Sluice at this point. And really, I'm afraid it is, like so many of them, a sewer today. The next river is the River Wandle, and this one I chose because of all the rivers in London, it's the one that you can follow above ground. It's got public footpath all the way up it, really, from pretty much from Croydon. You can walk all the way along it. Much of it is very lovely, and here's a picture showing where it goes. And my book says that the Wandle is mislaid rather than lost. But there is an 11-mile trail. Now the Domesday Book recorded 13 watermills and 14 inhabitants along it. So they must have worked very hard, mustn't they? Using the power of the river to grind their flour. In medieval period, mills were built for cleaning wool, malting for beer, dyeing and bleaching works set up, all using what was then very clean water. And later it became famous because William Morris used one of the mills and developed it for his textiles. More about that in a moment. By the 19th century, it was described as the hardest working river in London, but became so polluted that John Ruskin and the very early conservationists started the Wandle Open Spaces Society, which campaigned to clean it up, but it didn't work. And by the 1960s, its lowest ebb, it had really deteriorated and was actually categorised as a sewer. But this is a happy story because once again we can thank volunteers who led the way for a campaign, and it has now been returned to pre-industrial cleanliness and feels quite rural. So picking up the Wandle in Morden Park, the National Trust Park, where again you can see quite a bit of it above ground, managed by the National Trust, as I said. Going upriver we get to Merton Abbey Mills, which is described as an arts and crafts hub. Printed fashionable chintz from 1724, and Liberties took it over and produced silks here until as late as 1973. So this is the building where that was done, and then below it is the Wandle Watermill, which is a working tourist attraction run by volunteers. So if you're lucky on a Sunday, usually, you can actually see it working. So William Morris, took over the mill, although actually apparently it had been built by the Huguenot silk weavers originally, and he used it not only for textiles, weaving carpets and tapestries, but he really went there because he wanted his apprentices to have a healthy life. So he provided accommodation and food and training for them. Finally, the company went into liquidation in 1940, then war got the better of it. But the one very important reason for following the Wandle today is it passes the site of arguably the origins of our democracy. In 1114, Henry I granted land to Gilbert the Norman, who built a church and an Augustinian priory here. It became a famed centre of learning. All the medieval kings came here. In 1235, Henry III and the barons held the first parliament and produced the statutes of Merton, which are considered to be the basis of the English common law. This is the remains of the chapter house, sadly under the age 24. Again, this mostly thanks to dedicated volunteers, has been saved with very large grants. And you can visit it, but it's really hard to find out when it's open. Large stretches of the priory, unfortunately, are under Sainsbury's. However, they are to be credited with helping to save what remains. Thomas Becket and Thomas Breakspear, who was the only English pope ever, were both educated here at the priory. The Wandle then goes on, and I'm not going to follow it in detail because I hope you will walk it, but this next picture shows where it's joining the Thames. There are several pictures really. And the river is really surprisingly attractive, surrounded by a very industrial area. And of course Wandsworth, when you think about it, the whole area of Wandsworth is named after the River Wandle. Well, I think we should think just a little bit about the future. Water has come to the fore, not only because of the programmes about our polluted rivers, but also thinking about flood management and saving water, about cleaning them up. And our very own Muswell River in Queenswood rises from two springs there, and you can follow it down, just a little trick really, and it goes under the wall, under Woodvale, goes down all the way through Tottenham and comes out into the River Lee eventually. There's a splendid walk, and there are leaflets which you can pick up after the talk, which actually show it to you. And finally, something that I find really very encouraging, there is a charity called Thames 21, and its dedicated chair called John Miles has been working for years to get money to unculvert bits of the Muswell all the way down, and lately he has been told that Arup, the famous engineers, are prepared to act as sponsors and take over the management of the very big unculverting project. It's enormous when you think of the planning permissions that are needed and so on, and to provide some funding. And although it's a very long project, 20 to 30 years, it does seem to be a very real one. So I think that's a very positive note on which to end the talk.